The lecture hall was large and quiet, built to hold many species at once. The ceiling was high, shaped like a shallow dome, and soft white light spread evenly across the room. Rows of long desks curved toward the front, where a wide glass screen waited. Symbols from many languages glowed faintly along the walls, reminders that this academy did not belong to one world. Cadets filled the seats. Some were tall, some short, some smooth-skinned, some covered in scales or fur. A few breathed through masks. Others used small devices clipped to their necks to help them speak. All of them wore the same dark uniform, marked only with a silver badge of the Interstellar Defense Academy. Today was exam day. This was not a normal test. It was known as the final reasoning assessment, the one that decided which cadets would move into command tracks and which would be sent to support roles. Failing it did not mean disgrace, but passing it meant power. An older instructor stood beside it. His skin was pale gray, his eyes deep-set and calm. He did not raise his voice, yet every cadet heard him clearly. "You have 3 hours," he said. "You will be shown a simulated star system. Your task is simple in words, but difficult in truth. Identify the greatest threat to long-term stability. Not the loudest danger. Not the fastest. The greatest." The screen shifted, showing a map of a distant system. Several planets orbited a yellow star. Data streams appeared around it. Trade routes, military strength, population numbers, known species activity. The cadets leaned forward. Some immediately recognized patterns. A massive fleet from a warrior species hovered near the outer planets. A machine intelligence controlled several mining moons. A fast-spreading biological swarm lurked beyond sensor range. The exam began. Most cadets worked quickly. Their species had been raised to spot danger. Large weapons, high numbers, clear hostility. Fingers moved across touch panels, highlighting threats, drawing attack lines, writing explanations. Quiet discussion was forbidden, but the room still felt alive with thought. In the third row, slightly to the left, a human woman sat still. She was not tall. She did not wear anything special. Her dark hair was tied back simply. Her face showed no strong emotion. She watched the simulation without rushing. The cadet beside her, a long-limbed being with golden eyes, glanced over and frowned. Everyone else was already marking targets. Why was the human not moving? The woman in row 3 studied the data slowly. She zoomed in on population charts. She replayed past conflict records. She watched how resources flowed, how alliances shifted over time. She did not focus on the biggest fleet. She did not focus on the machines. She focused on patterns that repeated quietly in the background. 2 rows ahead, a cadet marked the machine intelligence as the top threat. It had perfect logic, endless patience, and no fear. Several others agreed. Another group highlighted the warrior fleet. Their ships were large, their weapons strong, their culture built on conquest. These answers were safe. They were expected. The human woman continued to watch. She noticed how often humans appeared in the data logs, not as leaders, not as conquerors, as survivors. Refugees, engineers, hired fighters, emergency allies. Humans were always there after something went wrong. She replayed an old event from the simulation history. A trade collapse. Several species lost colonies. Humans lost theirs too, but rebuilt faster, not bigger, just faster. She replayed another. A failed alliance. Humans were betrayed. They adapted. They changed tactics. They survived. Her fingers finally moved.
Identify the greatest threat.
Identify the greatest threat. She paused. Around her, cadets were already submitting. Some leaned back, confident. Others made last-second edits, worried but sure they had chosen correctly. The woman typed carefully. She did not name a fleet. She did not name a species from the simulation list. She wrote one word. Humanity. Then she added an explanation, short and clear. Humans adapt under pressure. Loss increases their creativity. They do not stop when logic says stop. They turn survival into a weapon. She read it once more. Then she submitted. The system accepted her answer. At the front of the hall, a soft, alert tone sounded at the instructor's console. It was brief, almost hidden under the normal system noise. The instructor glanced down. One of his eyes narrowed slightly. A flagged response. That was rare. He tapped the console and skimmed the highlighted answer. His expression did not change much, but his posture shifted. Beside him, a younger instructor leaned over. "What is it?" The older one did not answer right away. He looked out over the room. His gaze stopped briefly on row 3. The human woman met his eyes for a moment, then looked back at the screen. The younger instructor followed the gaze. "A human?" He frowned. "They always do this, don't they? Overthinking. Trying to be clever." "Perhaps," the older instructor said quietly. "Or perhaps not." The exam continued. Time passed. As cadets finished, they submitted and waited. The room grew quieter. Some students glanced at others, trying to read faces. A few looked nervous, a few looked proud. The human woman waited calmly. When the final timer ended, the screen went dark. The instructor stepped forward. "You are dismissed," he said. "Results will be reviewed. Some of you may be called back for clarification." Chairs moved. Conversations started in low voices. Cadets filed out in groups. In the hallway outside, reactions were immediate. "That was easy," one cadet said. "Obviously, the machines." "No," said another. "The swarm, it always starts small." "Humans are too scattered to matter," said a third. "They are useful, but not dangerous." The human woman walked alone. She did not hurry. She did not smile. She knew what would happen next. Behind her, inside the lecture hall, the instructors replayed the flagged answer. The younger one shook his head. "This is nonsense. Calling your own species the threat? That is either arrogance or fear or honesty," the older instructor said. He expanded the explanation. Simple words. No drama, no exaggeration. The younger instructor scoffed. "Humans are fragile. Short-lived, they argue with each other more than with enemies." "Yes," the older one said, "and yet they are still here." He pulled up records beyond the exam simulation. Real historical data. Humanity's early years in space were chaotic. Failed colonies. Internal wars. Near extinction events. Still, they adapted. They learned. They survived. The younger instructor crossed his arms. Even so, they lack unity. They lack numbers. For now, the older instructor said. He looked again at the answer. "Threat is not about intent," he said softly. "It is about potential." The system chimed again. Another alert. Not an exam notice. An incoming message from Academy Oversight. The older instructor opened it. His expression finally changed. The message was short. Prepare evaluation panel. Human cadet flagged response may be accurate. The younger instructor went silent. Outside, the human woman reached her quarters. She sat on the edge of her bed and removed her badge, placing it carefully on the desk. She took a slow breath. This academy liked answers that fit inside rules. Humans had never survived by following rules. She looked at the door, knowing it would open soon. The exam was over. The real test was about to begin. The instructors gathered in the observation room above the hall. The room was filled with screens showing every cadet's work, the simulation, and real-time metrics. Light reflected off glass panels and the soft hum of processors filled the air. The flagged response from row 3 stayed in the center, highlighted in a pale amber glow. It was different from all other answers, but the older instructor insisted on studying it carefully. The young instructor leaned closer to the console. "Are you really saying this human could be right?" he asked. "Her species? A threat to everyone else?" The older instructor did not answer immediately. He watched the data play through the simulation again. He zoomed in on the patterns the human cadet had pointed out. Every situation where humans were cornered ended in survival. Every time the odds were stacked against them, humans adapted in ways that others never expected.
"Look at this," he said quietly, pointing to one panel. "On planet Vera, the humans lost nearly all their ships."
They had no allies nearby. Their supplies were minimal. They should have failed completely. The young instructor looked at the screen and frowned. They did fail. Most of the fleet was destroyed.
"Yes," the older instructor said. "But then—"
Notice what happened next. The survivors used civilian transport vessels to evacuate the remaining population. They modified mining equipment into weapons. They coordinated attacks in ways no other species had predicted. Within 2 simulation cycles, they had recovered key positions and inflicted significant damage on the enemy. The young instructor shook his head. "That is clever, but it is a simulation. Any species could have acted like that under guidance." The older instructor tapped the screen. "Perhaps. But consider the speed and the creativity. There is no other species that consistently does this under pressure. Look at the patterns across multiple scenarios. The flagged cadet noticed this immediately. Most students would have chosen the loudest, most obvious danger. She looked at the long-term effect humans have in every scenario. The young instructor crossed his arms. "You are saying we should treat a single student's answer seriously because she can see a pattern others miss?" "I am saying," the older instructor replied, "that humans are underestimated. We always underestimate them." He leaned back, thinking. He remembered the historical records he had access to. Human colonies that were abandoned after disasters, refugees who rebuilt entire worlds in years, humans who survived plagues and climate collapse, humans who learned from betrayal and repeated failures. Other species might have been stronger, but humans endured. He turned to the young instructor. This exam was supposed to measure perception and reasoning. Most cadets focused on the obvious. The human in row 3 focused on survival potential. That is more valuable than raw strength. The young instructor finally looked at the flagged answer again. Humans adapt. Loss increases creativity. They do not stop when logic says stop. They turn survival into a weapon. He frowned. "It sounds arrogant." "Perhaps," the older instructor said. "Or perhaps it is truth. The simulations are designed to measure immediate threat, but survival potential is a different kind of threat. If left unchecked, it can turn the weakest species into the most dangerous." The young instructor considered this. He thought about the cadets who had already submitted. Their answers were predictable. Machines, fleets, swarms. Logical. Safe. The human's answer broke the mold. "We should call her in," he said. The older instructor nodded. Yes. She must explain her reasoning. Meanwhile, the human cadet walked through the hallways of the academy, unaware that the instructors had flagged her answer. She passed groups of students still talking about the exam. Most discussed strategy. Some bragged about the fleets they had identified as threats. A few glanced at her but kept walking. Humans were always underestimated. Most other species never thought they were important. She returned to her quarters and sat quietly. She opened her datapad and began reviewing the simulation. She replayed the same events the instructors had been watching. Every detail mattered. Every choice, every sequence of adaptation, every unexpected decision made by humans was recorded. Hours passed. The hallways grew empty. The lights dimmed slightly. Yet she did not move. She watched. She noted. She calculated. A soft chime sounded at her door. She looked up. An envelope slid through the slot. It was an official notice. "You are requested to report to the observation chamber for review of your recent exam response." She read the words carefully, then closed the envelope. She did not seem surprised. This was expected. The academy had a habit of calling out cadets who challenged norms. Those who did were rarely congratulated. They were studied, evaluated, questioned. When she arrived at the observation chamber, the instructors were already waiting. The older instructor gestured to a seat. "Sit," he said. She did. She did not speak immediately. The older instructor leaned forward, resting his hands on the console. He looked at her calmly. "Your answer is unusual," he said. She nodded slightly. "That was not a lie." "Explain," he asked. "Why did you mark humans as the greatest threat in the system?" She spoke clearly, without hesitation. "Humans adapt faster than any other species. They use loss to fuel creativity. They do not stop when logic says stop. They survive under conditions that would destroy others." She paused. "And when they survive, they become more capable than before." The younger instructor scoffed. "That is theoretical. That is philosophy, not strategy." She looked at him directly. "It is also history. Look at every human failure, every disaster, every colony lost. Humans came back stronger. They do not need fleets larger than others. They do not need perfect AI. They need persistence, adaptability, and willingness to risk everything." The older instructor nodded slightly. "That is what I wanted to hear." He tapped a few controls, bringing up historical records from real human campaigns, not simulations. He showed her how humans had survived near extinction multiple times, how they had been outnumbered, outgunned, betrayed, and still persisted. The human cadet observed silently. She had studied these events herself, but it was different to see them presented this way. The young instructor was uneasy. "You are saying humans are more dangerous than machines, more dangerous than fleets?" She met his gaze evenly. "Not because they are stronger, because they refuse to stop." He shook his head. "Impossible," he muttered. The older instructor leaned back. "It may seem impossible, but our records show it repeatedly. That is why your response was flagged. You noticed something no one else did." She nodded once. "I noticed it." The young instructor rubbed his temples. "So what happens now?" "You will continue your studies," the older instructor said. "But we will observe. Every move you make will be reviewed. Your understanding of survival potential will be tested further." She did not react. Observation was normal. It was expected. Outside the chamber, the day faded. The stars outside the academy shimmered faintly in the night sky. Human ships passed quietly in orbit. They were not powerful. They were not large. They were persistent. That alone made them dangerous. The instructors watched her leave the chamber. She walked with calm confidence. They could not deny it. She had seen what they had not. The young instructor finally spoke. "I do not like this. Humans, they are unpredictable." The older instructor smiled faintly. "That is exactly why they are valuable. That is exactly why they are dangerous." The human cadet returned to her quarters. She opened her datapad again and began replaying the simulation. She studied the mistakes of others, the predictable choices. She noted how often others ignored long-term survival patterns. She recorded her own thoughts carefully, considering every scenario. Outside, the academy remained quiet. Only the hum of distant engines and faint lights of distant planets disturbed the stillness. The older instructor remained in the observation chamber, reviewing the flagged answer. He watched every replay, every variation, every subtle choice. He knew that this human cadet was not like the others. She saw danger where others ignored it. She understood potential when others saw only power. And he knew the Academy had underestimated humanity once again. The exam was over. The answer was submitted. But the real evaluation had just begun. The human cadet was ready. She did not fear scrutiny. She did not seek praise. She only sought understanding. The instructors, however, were not ready for what they had unleashed. Even as the night fell across the academy, the message was clear. The species they had always overlooked might be the most dangerous force in the galaxy, and the cadet in row 3 had noticed it first. No one spoke as the observation chamber went silent. The system recorded every word, every thought, every reflection. Even if the cadet did not know it, the examination had already begun in reality. And in the quiet, the older instructor whispered to himself, "Humanity is not the problem yet, but it could be." The young instructor turned to him, eyes wide. "Are we making a mistake?" "Perhaps," the older one replied. "Or perhaps we are just beginning to understand the truth." Outside, the stars watched silently, and in row 3, a human cadet prepared herself for the challenges no one else could yet see. The simulation room was quiet, except for the hum of processors. The map of the distant star system glowed across the wide screen. Several planets orbited their sun in perfect arcs. Streams of trade, military movements, and population data flowed across the display. Most cadets had already left the simulation for the day, but the human cadet in row 3 remained seated, studying the details with calm focus. The older instructor and his team returned to the observation chamber to watch the flag scenario again. The human cadet had requested a repeat of this simulation under extreme conditions, and the instructors had agreed, though reluctantly. Most other cadets assumed the exercise was over. They did not realize that the real test was about to begin. The simulation restarted. This time, humans were pushed to the edge. Their colonies on 2 planets had been attacked by a massive warrior fleet. Supply lines were cut. Mining stations were destroyed. Alliances with other species had collapsed under political pressure. The map displayed a near-complete loss of human assets. On the surface, failure seemed inevitable. Cadets watching the simulation from observation screens murmured. No species had ever survived these conditions. Even machine intelligences would have collapsed under such losses. The human cadet watched silently, her eyes scanning the maps, the movement of fleets, the status of populations. She noticed patterns that no other cadet had. Humans never acted like the other species. When pressed, they improvised. When cornered, they used unconventional resources. When surrounded, they adapted in ways predicted by no algorithm in the system. The first sign of a shift occurred when civilian transport ships were repurposed. Mining equipment was converted into defensive weapons. Even simple construction drones were reprogrammed to act as reconnaissance and combat tools. In less than a simulation cycle, humans were no longer simply defending. They were creating traps, planning ambushes, and preparing counterattacks. Observers gasped silently. This was unexpected. The instructors leaned closer. The human cadet in row 3 remained calm. She had predicted this response. Humans always use desperation as a tool. On the screen, a group of enemy ships entered a corridor that humans had declared impassable. They assumed the humans were too weak to defend it. Suddenly, explosions erupted along the enemy line. The corridor was filled with hidden weapons converted from mining drones and transport hulls. Enemy vessels took heavy damage and were forced to retreat. The young instructor stared at the display. "That is impossible," he whispered. "Their numbers were too low. Their weapons are too weak." The older instructor smiled faintly. "That is exactly why they are dangerous." The simulation continued. Human forces moved like a tide, slow but unstoppable. They avoided direct confrontation with superior fleets, but struck precisely where vulnerability existed. Resource points were reclaimed with minimal losses. Damaged ships were repaired using scavenged parts. Every setback strengthened their resolve and taught new tactics. Cadets observing the simulation from their dorms saw only chaos at first. Then patterns began to emerge. Humans never panicked. Humans never surrendered in the simulation. Humans learned from each failure, using every loss as a lesson to improve strategy. The older instructor paused the simulation briefly to zoom in on a single event. One of the human colonies had been surrounded. Enemy forces outnumbered them 5-1. Every conventional approach would have ended in total destruction. The human cadet explained her reasoning calmly. They will not fight conventionally. They will use misdirection, traps, and decoys. They will survive because giving up is never an option. The young instructor frowned. They are still weak.
They should have been eliminated already. Exactly, the older instructor said.
And yet they persist. Notice the subtle movements of their remaining fleets. They are not visible on primary scans, but they are repositioning, conserving energy and preparing for counterattacks. Their weakness is their strength. It makes them unpredictable. The simulation resumed. Enemy forces pressed harder, expecting the humans to collapse. Instead, human ships coordinated with civilian transports, using them as shields and distractions. Mining drones triggered traps. Resource caches were hidden, then deployed as surprise weapons. Every enemy attempt to overwhelm human positions failed. The cadets watching were stunned. Most had expected the humans to be eliminated within the first cycle. Now, they were seeing humans turning the tide. In row 3, the human cadet remained focused. She noted each enemy move, each human adaptation. She recorded observations. Humans were not powerful in the traditional sense. They did not rely on large fleets or advanced machines. Their advantage was persistence, creativity, and learning from every failure. The enemy fleet, confident at first, began to suffer losses. Small attacks disrupted logistics, communication, and coordination. Meantime, ships that should have moved as one were delayed or destroyed by unexpected tactics. Enemy commanders recalculated constantly, but each change was anticipated by human improvisation. One simulation cycle ended. Human losses were minimal compared to enemy losses. The cadets watching were silent. This had never been seen in the academy before. The older instructor leaned back. The young instructor was speechless. "How can a species so small cause this much disruption?" he asked. "Because," the older instructor said, "they do not follow expectations. They survive by being unpredictable. Every loss teaches them. Every failure improves them. That is why the student in row 3 identified them as the greatest threat." The simulation continued for multiple cycles. Human forces began reclaiming lost territory. Enemy movements became cautious. They could no longer assume victory. Even machine intelligences hesitated, unable to anticipate human adaptability. The human cadet explained her observations to the instructors. "Notice how humans never retreat fully? Notice how they use damaged resources creatively. Notice how each loss strengthens their coordination. They do not rely on brute force. They rely on learning and persistence." Cadets in other parts of the academy began whispering about the human simulation. What is happening? How are humans surviving? Even small fleets seemed to anticipate every move. The older instructor ignored the whispers. He focused on the simulation. The student in row 3 had done exactly what he suspected. She had seen potential where others saw weakness. She had understood the power of adaptability. The enemy fleet made one final push in the simulation, concentrating forces to eliminate the last human colony. Conventional strategy predicted total human defeat. The simulation calculated nearly 90% probability of failure. The human cadet predicted it differently. The humans would split into small mobile units, use civilian ships as shields, and lure enemy ships into traps. They would sacrifice minor positions to save the larger system. The instructors watched as the simulation unfolded, exactly as the cadet predicted. Enemy ships entered traps. Supply lines were cut. Small human forces outmaneuvered larger fleets. The final human colony survived intact, with enemy losses severe and morale shattered. "This is extraordinary," the older instructor nodded. "And this is why she marked humans as the greatest threat." Even as the simulation ended, the cadet in row 3 continued analyzing data. She did not celebrate or react emotionally. Survival was not an achievement. It was a process. Humans had survived countless failures before, and she knew this was only the beginning. The instructors held a private meeting. The younger one was unsettled. Can we trust a single cadet's observations to evaluate an entire species? "We do not have a choice," the older instructor said. "Look at the results. The simulations confirm her analysis. Humans are dangerous not because of power, but because of persistence, learning, and unpredictability." The cadet in row 3 left the simulation room quietly. She did not look back. She knew the instructors were watching, and she did not fear scrutiny. Humans were always underestimated. Most species ignored their survival potential. That was a mistake repeated too often. Outside, the stars twinkled in distant galaxies. Human ships moved quietly in orbit, barely noticeable. They were few in number, fragile, but resilient. Their persistence alone made them dangerous. The instructors reviewed every detail of the simulation. They realized the cadet had been correct. The threat that everyone had ignored was not visible on the map, not obvious in numbers or power. It was humanity itself. The older instructor whispered to the young one. "Row 3 was right. Humans are not the strongest, but they will endure longer than any other species. When cornered, They do not break. They adapt. They survive. And that is why they are dangerous. The young instructor was silent. He had never seen anything like this. The human cadet returned to her quarters. She opened her data pad and began documenting the events. Each simulation cycle was recorded. Every adaptation, every choice, every unexpected tactic was noted. Humans survived not because of strength, but because of creativity and persistence. The Academy had just begun to understand the truth. Humanity was a force that could not be ignored. And in row 3, the human cadet prepared for the next challenge, knowing that this understanding would be tested again. The exam had ended. The simulation had concluded. But the real test of humanity's potential was just beginning. No one in the Academy would ever forget the results of this simulation. It was quiet, subtle, and devastating. Humanity had survived the impossible. And it was only the beginning. The Academy's archives were vast, filled with records from hundreds of worlds, spanning centuries of history. The older instructor led the human cadet through the tall, glowing shelves. The air was quiet. Only the hum of data streams filled the space. They stopped in front of a section labeled Pre-Alliance Conflicts, Human Sector. The cadet observed the records calmly. She had studied human history herself, but seeing the data organized like this gave a new perspective. Each folder contained reports of disasters, wars, plagues, and near-extinction events. Many of the older species had assumed humans would fail, yet humans had survived all of them. The older instructor gestured to one record. Here, he said, was the collapse of the Veyron colonies, outnumbered 5-1. Resources destroyed. Allies abandoned them. Most species would have vanished. And yet, humans endured. The cadet nodded. They improvised, used civilian vessels, scavenged materials, and rebuilt stronger positions than before. Exactly. She predicted this in the simulation, he said. Most cadets focused only on immediate threats. They looked for big fleets, advanced AI, or biological swarms. She saw potential and survival ability. They walked along the archives. A folder showed human plagues. Mortality rates were extreme, but humans learned from each outbreak. Medical knowledge spread, tactics improved, and colonies adapted. No other species could recover so quickly after repeated disasters. The young instructor, who had been observing quietly, stepped closer. "How is this possible?" he asked. "Even by today's standards, humans should not have survived these failures." The older instructor looked at him. Humans survive because they never stop trying. They adapt. They know. They learn from every failure. When cornered, they become more capable. It is not strength in numbers or technology that makes them dangerous. It is their persistence. The cadet watched silently, absorbing the information. The Academy had underestimated humans for centuries. They focused on obvious power, not on survival skill. That was why her exam answer had been flagged. She had seen what others ignored. The instructors opened another folder. This one contained records of the Renak War. Human colonies were betrayed by allies, attacked simultaneously on multiple fronts. Supply lines severed, fleet destroyed, leadership compromised. Probability of survival, nearly zero. Yet humans rebuilt, formed new alliances, and regained lost ground in less than 2 cycles. The young instructor's jaw tightened. They were lucky. That is all. Luck, the older instructor said, has little to do with it. Humans plan for uncertainty. They expect failure and prepare for it. When disaster strikes, they adapt, improvise, and survive. repeatedly. The cadet looked at him. "That is why humans survive," she said. "Even when everything is against them, they do not give up." The older instructor smiled faintly. "And that is why she is correct in identifying humanity as a potential threat. Not a threat in the sense of aggression, but in terms of endurance, adaptability, and unpredictability." They continued through the archives. The cadet saw events she had known, but now analyzed differently. Planetary disasters, climate collapse, failed colonies, invasions. Humans adapted each time. Every record was another example of creativity under pressure. One folder showed a series of conflicts on the border of the human sector. Other species abandoned their positions. Humans held out, sometimes with improvised weapons, sometimes by rerouting trade and supply. They never surrendered. They always survived. The young instructor looked unconvinced. "They survived because no one attacked efficiently," he said. "No," the older instructor said. "Look at the patterns. They survived even when attacked efficiently. They learned from failure. They turned weakness into strength. That is why the simulation mirrored reality." The cadet paused at a record showing a minor rebellion within a human colony. Internal conflict could have destroyed them. Instead, they reorganized leadership, distributed responsibilities, and survived with minimal loss. Humans never need perfect conditions. They can survive chaos, betrayal, and scarcity.
They adapt to whatever challenges appear, the older instructor nodded.
That is why the student in row 3 identified humans as the greatest threat. Most cadets look for obvious danger. She looked for potential, and history confirms she was right. They reached the final section of the archives. It contained early space exploration records. Humans had few ships, limited resources, and minimal technology compared to other species. Yet they survived hostile environments, survived diplomatic failures, and even survived alien attacks. The young instructor leaned closer to the display. "They survived because they were cautious," he said. The cadet shook her head. "No. They survived because they never stopped. They used whatever was available, learned from mistakes, and adapted to survive. Caution alone would not have saved them." The older instructor tapped the screen, bringing up a visualization of multiple human disasters over time. "Look," he said, "every crisis that should have ended humanity instead made them stronger. Every loss led to adaptation. Every failure led to innovation." The young instructor was silent, staring at the data. It was undeniable. Humans persisted when every other species failed. They were not the strongest. They were not the fastest. They were not the most numerous. But their endurance and adaptability made them more capable than anyone realized. The cadet closed her eyes for a moment, reflecting. "That is what I saw during the exam," she said quietly. "Most cadets focused on the obvious threats. I focused on survival potential." The older instructor nodded. "And history proves you were right." The young instructor finally spoke. "Then what do we do? Humans are still here. They will survive anything. That is unsettling." The older instructor sighed. "That is why your exam response is important. The academy is always evaluated immediate power."
You evaluated endurance.
Potential, survival skill, and that is what matters in the long term. The cadet nodded. She understood. This was not about fleets or machines. It was about persistence and adaptability. Humanity had survived disasters others could not even imagine. and they would continue to survive, no matter what obstacles appeared. The older instructor gestured to the archive records. "Keep studying," he said. "Understand how humans operate. Recognize what others overlook. If the galaxy underestimates them again, the results could be unpredictable." The young instructor rubbed his forehead. "So we need to change how we view humans?" he asked. "Yes," the older instructor said. "They are a species that cannot be ignored, not because of aggression, but because of endurance, because they adapt, because they survive. And history shows that nothing else can stop them." The cadet remained silent, but she understood. She had always known humans were resilient. Now, with these records, the instructors also understood. Outside, the academy was quiet. The stars shimmered in distant galaxies. Human ships moved in orbit, few in number, unnoticed. But they persisted. Every disaster they survived, every battle they endured, made them stronger. The older instructor turned to the young one. "Remember this," he said. "The species you think is weak may be the one that endures the longest. The species you ignore may be the one that shapes the future." The young instructor nodded slowly, still uneasy.
Humans.
He muttered, "They survive everything." The cadet left the archives and returned to her quarters. She reviewed the simulations and the historical records. Every disaster, every loss, every unexpected adaptation was noted. Humans never stopped. They never gave up, and every time they were pushed to the edge, they became stronger. The older instructor returned to the observation chamber alone. He studied the data one last time before recording his report. Humanity was a species unlike any other. They were not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most numerous, but their endurance, their adaptability, and their refusal to give up made them unpredictable and dangerous. And in row 3, a human cadet had seen it first. She had recognized potential where others saw weakness. She had identified humanity as the greatest threat, not because of violence, not because of fleets, not because of power, but because they would survive when no one else could. The Academy had finally begun to see what had always been true. Humanity endured. Humanity adapted. Humanity survived. And that was a lesson the galaxy would soon have to learn. The alarms in the Academy blared sharply, echoing through the corridors. The command screens lit up in red, showing incoming signals from a distant system in the outer sector. The message was brief but urgent. An unknown force had begun attacks on civilian colonies. The system's defenses were minimal, and the standard protocol suggested immediate evacuation and defensive positioning. In the observation chamber, instructors gathered quickly. The older instructor gestured to the screen. "Prepare an assessment," he said.
Evaluate the threat. The young instructor tapped the console, running simulations and comparing known data.
The incoming force moved fast, with weapon systems unlike anything in the records. Their approach was systematic, but unpredictable. The cadets who had studied defensive strategies from simulations worked frantically, suggesting fleets to intercept, weapons to deploy, colonies to abandon. The human cadet in row 3 entered the chamber quietly. She was calm, as always. She had been reviewing survival patterns when the alarms went off. She watched the approaching threat with careful attention. Unlike the other cadets, she did not panic or suggest immediate retreats. Instead, she scanned the enemy formation, identifying weak points and behavioral patterns. The older instructor looked at her. "Your insights?" he said. "What do you recommend?" She studied the display and pointed to the enemy vectors. "They assumed conventional tactics," she said. "They will strike what seems most vulnerable, but that is A trap. They are predictable because they rely on strength and numbers. The colonies they expect to hit first are not the true target. The human survivors will adapt and respond, but only if we give them space to do so. The young instructor frowned. "We cannot leave the colonies undefended," he said. "The casualties will be high." She shook her head. "Defend where it matters. Sacrifice where it does not." "Humans do not need perfect conditions," he said. "They will survive the apparent losses and turn them into advantages. We must anticipate that." The older instructor nodded. "Then we follow your plan." The cadet activated the command interface. She deployed small human-led units strategically, not in direct confrontation, but as lures. Civilian ships were hidden or repurposed. Supply lines were redirected to create false weaknesses. Each human fleet was placed where they could adapt, improvise, and strike back unexpectedly. The enemy fleet advanced as predicted. They hit what they believed were weak colonies first. They expected little resistance. Explosions erupted as hidden traps activated. Small human units appeared from unexpected locations, disabling communications, damaging weapons, and forcing enemy maneuvers.
Observers gasped. The simulation predicted near total human losses.
The reality was completely different. Humans were not only surviving, they were reversing the situation. The cadet remained calm, issuing instructions quietly. She did not command with authority. She suggested patterns, movements, and adaptive responses. Humans followed instinctively, improvising within the framework she created. Enemy forces tried to respond. They concentrated fleets and attempted direct assaults, but every predictable move was countered by human improvisation. Mining vessels became shields, cargo drones became reconnaissance, and damaged ships became traps. The older instructor watched, fascinated. The pattern matched exactly what she had said. The human response was not just survival, it was learning and adapting in real time. One enemy assault broke through a perimeter, hitting a colony. The young instructor flinched. "Casualties will be high," he muttered. The human cadet quickly recalculated. "That loss was expected," she said. "It triggers adaptation. Resources and attention will shift naturally."
Humans will survive because they will turn the loss into leverage.
She directed units to draw the enemy further into controlled zones. Explosions and sudden attacks disoriented the enemy. Communication lines were disrupted, and the attacking force became scattered. Humans struck precisely at weak points, slowly regaining territory. The young instructor watched in disbelief. "They should not be doing this," he said. "They are too few. Their resources are too low." "Exactly," the older instructor said. "That is why they are dangerous. They do not rely on strength alone. They rely on endurance, adaptability, and the ability to learn from every setback." The human cadet noted every enemy move and predicted the next. She anticipated a flanking maneuver. She instructed human units to counter with decoys and trap formations. The enemy fleet moved as expected, falling into prepared positions. Small human forces disabled key engines and communication arrays, creating confusion. The simulation showed enemy morale decreasing rapidly. Units broke formation. Some retreated entirely. The human cadet's plan was working perfectly. Humans survived, adapted, and turned defense into offense without overextending. The young instructor leaned back in shock. "This is, unbelievable," he whispered. "They are reversing the battle with fewer ships and weaker weapons." The older instructor nodded. "Humans have always done this. It is why they endure. They do not need perfect conditions. only persistence and adaptability. Across the galaxy, the unknown attackers had assumed humans were weak and predictable. They had counted on fast victories and minimal resistance. Every assumption had been wrong. Humans were unpredictable in ways no algorithm or strategic analysis could fully capture. The cadet's eyes scanned the entire system. She noted small clusters of human survivors in unexpected locations. Each cluster acted independently, but within the adaptive framework she had established. Losses were minimal compared to the enemy, and every loss strengthened the response. A critical strike was approaching one of the last surviving colonies. The enemy concentrated a large fleet to overwhelm defenses. The cadet quickly adjusted the strategy. She divided human units into smaller groups, using decoy fleets to draw the enemy away. Hidden mining drones targeted engines, slowing the attack. Civilian transports converted into distractions forced the enemy to split focus. The enemy fleet's advance faltered. Ships collided with traps, misfired weapons, and unexpected resistance. The critical colony remained intact. Human losses were small. The tide was turning. Observers in the academy began whispering among themselves. Humans. They are actually turning the fight around. The young instructor could not hide his astonishment. How? He stammered. They are winning? The older instructor nodded. It is exactly what we predicted based on historical patterns. Humans survive. They adapt. They do not break when cornered. And every failure strengthens them further. The human cadet continued issuing subtle instructions. She did not command directly, but suggested adaptive responses and predicted enemy moves. The humans followed instinctively, improvising and learning in real time. The enemy fleet finally began to retreat. Disorganized, weakened, and confused, they pulled back. Humans had not overwhelmed them with raw strength, but had survived, adapted, and reversed the situation. The older instructor watched quietly. The pattern was unmistakable. Humans never lost completely. They never gave up. They always turned disadvantage into opportunity. The young instructor remained silent. He had never seen anything like this in simulations or historical records. Humans were supposed to fail. Yet here they were, turning the fight around with fewer resources and unpredictable tactics. The human cadet observed the system one last time. Every loss had been calculated, every movement anticipated, every adaptation effective. Humans had survived the attack, not with superior technology or numbers, but with persistence, creativity, and learning. The older instructor turned to the young one. Row 3 was correct, he said. Humans are not the strongest, but they endure longer than any other species. When cornered, they do not break. They adapt. They survive. That is why they are dangerous. The young instructor nodded slowly. I understand, he said, and that is why we must pay attention. Humans cannot be ignored. The human cadet left the observation chamber quietly. She did not seek recognition. She had merely applied what she knew. Humans survived because they never stopped, even in impossible situations. Outside, distant stars twinkled over the academy. Human ships moved quietly in orbit, few in number, fragile yet unstoppable. The galaxy had underestimated them, yet they had shown their ability to endure and adapt under pressure. The older instructor recorded his report. He explained the situation in careful detail. The unknown fleet had been repelled not by brute force, but by survival skill. Humans had turned disaster into opportunity. They were unpredictable, adaptive, and dangerous in a way that few species could understand. The young instructor remained uneasy. How can we prepare for them? He asked. We observe, the older instructor replied. We learn. We understand what others have ignored for centuries. Humans endure because they must. They survive because they adapt. And history proves they will not fail, no matter the obstacle. In row 3, the human cadet returned to her quarters. She reviewed every action, every movement, every adaptation. Humans had survived the impossible once again. She knew this was only the beginning. The galaxy would soon see what humans were capable of when cornered, and it would be unlike anything predicted. The unknown threat had been repelled. Human losses were minimal, yet every action had taught lessons. Every failure had created adaptation, and every obstacle had strengthened them. The Academy now understood what the cadet had seen from the start. Humanity was not the most powerful in conventional terms, but their endurance, adaptability, and refusal to give up made them a force that could not be ignored. The exam had ended long ago, but the real test, the demonstration of human potential under real-world conditions, had only just begun. And in row 3, the human cadet prepared for the next challenge, quietly confident that humanity would endure whatever came next, stronger and more unpredictable than anyone had ever expected. The Academy was quiet in the early hours. Outside, the stars glimmered across the endless blackness of space. Human ships orbited planets quietly, almost unnoticed. The cadet in row 3 walked slowly down the wide corridor of the Academy, her mind focused on what had happened. She had seen the simulations, the historical records, and now the real-world crisis. Humanity had survived every challenge presented, and she had guided them through it with careful observation and strategy. In the observation chamber, the older instructor reviewed the recordings of the recent engagement. Every movement of human ships, every adaptive choice, every improvisation had been captured in detail. He leaned back in his chair, reflecting on what he had just seen. Humans had survived what should have been impossible. Their losses had been minimal, yet every loss had been turned into a lesson, strengthening their response. The young instructor stood beside him, silent and uneasy. He had seen the simulations. He had seen the historical data. And now he had seen the humans in action. He could not deny it any longer. Humanity was dangerous, not because of raw power, but because of endurance, adaptability, and the unwillingness to give up. The older instructor turned to the young one. "Did you see it?" he asked. The human cadet in row 3 was right. Humans are not the largest fleets, the strongest weapons, or the fastest species, but they endure longer than any other. When cornered, they do not break. They adapt, they survive, and that is why they are a threat. The young instructor nodded slowly, still uneasy. "How can we prepare for them?"
he asked. "We cannot control them," the older instructor replied.
"We can only observe, learn, and understand. The galaxy has underestimated humans for too long. That must never happen again." Meanwhile, the human cadet returned to her quarters. She did not celebrate, did not boast, and did not relax. Humans had survived the attack, but this was only the beginning. She reviewed the data again, analyzing every movement, every adaptation, every unexpected response from both humans and the enemy. She recorded observations carefully, noting patterns that might help in future crises. Humans survived not by strength, but by learning, adapting, and enduring. That was their true power. Elsewhere in the Academy, other cadets whispered about what had happened. They had seen the simulations, the real-world engagement, and the outcomes. Humans had survived impossible odds. They had adapted, improvised, and emerged stronger than expected. Many cadets were astonished, others uneasy. No one had ever predicted humans could act this way under pressure. Most had assumed humans were weak, predictable, and insignificant. The events proved otherwise. The older instructor prepared his final report. He documented everything: the exam responses, the simulations, the historical data, and the real engagement. He highlighted the unique qualities of humanity: endurance, adaptability, unpredictability, and the ability to learn from failure. Humans were not aggressive by nature, but when cornered, they were unstoppable. No other species had shown this consistent ability to survive against overwhelming odds. Humanity could not be ignored. The young instructor reviewed the report. It was unsettling, he said. Humans survive everything, adapt constantly, and do not break. They are dangerous in ways we cannot predict. Exactly, the older instructor replied, and the cadet in row 3 has shown this from the beginning. She saw what others ignored, understood potential where others saw weakness, and proved that humanity is a force unlike any other. Outside the academy, human ships moved quietly through orbiting systems. They were few, fragile, and almost invisible compared to other fleets. Yet they persisted. Every disaster had made them stronger. Every attack had taught them new strategies. Every failure had become a lesson. They survived because they never stopped, because they adapted, because they endured. The cadet in row 3 reviewed her notes one last time before leaving her quarters. She had guided humans through a real-world crisis, demonstrating exactly what she had predicted. Humans had not relied on raw strength, numbers, or advanced technology. They had survived by being resilient, adaptable, and persistent. That was their true strength. In the academy, instructors discussed the implications. The older instructor addressed a group of senior officials. Humanity is not a threat because they seek to dominate, he said. Their threat comes from endurance, from the ability to survive when no one else can. We must study them carefully. We must observe, learn, and understand. Underestimating humans again would be a mistake no one could afford. The young instructor remained silent, still processing the events. Humans survive everything, he thought. They adapt in ways we cannot predict. They endure when others would fail. They are dangerous not because of strength, but because they refuse to give up. Meanwhile, the cadet in row 3 prepared for the next challenge. She knew the galaxy would continue to test humanity. New crises would arise. New enemies would appear. But she also knew that humans would endure. They would adapt. They would survive. That was the essence of her people, and it was what made them unstoppable. The older instructor finalized his report, emphasizing that the academy must adjust its perspective. Humanity could not be measured by conventional standards of strength. They were unpredictable, resilient, and adaptive. Any future conflict or engagement involving humans required careful observation and respect for their endurance. The young instructor looked out at the stars, realizing the truth he could no longer deny. Humans survive everything. They adapt to every challenge. They do not break. They are not the most powerful, but they are the most persistent, and that persistence makes them formidable. The cadet in row 3 returned to her simulation terminals, quietly analyzing every detail of human strategy, every adaptation, and every unexpected outcome. She knew the galaxy would continue to underestimate her people, but she also knew that humans would continue to endure, adapt, and survive. Every challenge only made them stronger. Every threat only taught them more. The older instructor reflected on what had occurred. The exam had been theoretical, the simulations predictive, and the real-world engagement decisive. Humanity had shown its true nature in every context. They were not the loudest or the strongest, but they were enduring, adaptive, and unpredictable. They were a force that could not be ignored. The young instructor finally spoke. "I understand now," he said. "Humans cannot be underestimated. They will survive when others fail. They will endure when others break. They are dangerous because they refuse to give up." The older instructor nodded. That is why the cadet in row 3 was correct from the start. She saw potential where others saw weakness. She identified humanity as the greatest threat, not in terms of aggression or power, but in terms of endurance and adaptability. That is the lesson the galaxy must learn. Outside, the stars shone silently. Human ships continued their quiet movements across space, few in number but resilient. Every disaster they faced had strengthened them. Every challenge they endured had made them more capable. They survived because they never stopped. They adapted because they had to. They endured because giving up was never an option. The cadet in row 3 paused for a moment, looking out at the stars. She understood that humanity's greatest power was not in fleets or weapons, but in their persistence and adaptability. They would survive every test, every attack, and every threat. They would endure when others could not. That was their true strength. The older instructor finalized his observation report. Humanity had demonstrated qualities unlike any other species: endurance, adaptability, and resilience. They were not aggressive conquerors, but they were unstoppable survivors. Any assessment of future galactic threats would have to account for these unique qualities. The young instructor, still uneasy, finally nodded. "I see it now," he said. "Humanity survives everything. They adapt, they endure, and that makes them unpredictable and formidable." The cadet in row 3 returned to her workstations, quietly preparing for whatever challenges the galaxy might present next. Humanity had survived impossible odds once again, proving that their greatest strength was not in numbers, technology, or fleets, but in their persistence, adaptability, and refusal to give up. The Academy had learned a critical lesson. The exam was over, the simulations had concluded, and the real engagement had been resolved. But the true understanding of humanity had only just begun. They were not the most powerful species by conventional measures, but their endurance, adaptability, and ability to survive under pressure made them a force that could not be ignored. And in row 3, the human cadet quietly prepared for the future, confident that humanity would continue to endure, adapt, and survive, no matter what the galaxy threw at them next. The stars above were silent witnesses. Humanity had survived, and they would continue to survive. They were not the loudest, they were not the fastest, they were not the most numerous, but they endured, they adapted, they survived. And that was the lesson the galaxy could not ignore. The Academy would remember row 3. The cadet had identified the greatest threat, not through aggression or power, but through persistence, adaptability, and survival. Humanity was underestimated for centuries, and now the truth was undeniable. The cadet returned to her analysis, preparing for the next unknown challenge. She knew the galaxy would continue to test humanity, but she also knew the essential truth: humans endure, they adapt, they survive, and nothing could stop them when they refuse to give up. The older instructor looked out at the stars, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. Humanity's resilience was undeniable. Their unpredictability was their strength. Their endurance was their power. And for the first time, the Academy understood what row 3 had known all along. Humanity was a species that could not be ignored, a species that survived everything, and a species that would continue to endure, adapt, and survive. The young instructor finally understood fully. He watched as the cadet quietly worked, realizing the depth of what she had shown. Humans survive when all else fails. They adapt when challenged. They endure when others break. And that made them a force unlike any other in the galaxy. And in row 3, the human cadet silently continued her preparations, knowing that the galaxy would soon see the truth. Humanity endured, humanity adapted, humanity survived, and nothing could stop them. The lesson was clear, final, and unavoidable. The greatest threat was not the loudest fleet, the most advanced technology, or the largest army. The greatest threat was humanity itself, enduring in row 3, watching, learning, and surviving against all odds. Slowly, quietly, inevitably, humanity survived. Humanity adapted, humanity endured, and in row 3, one human cadet had seen it first. The exam was identify the threat. They all picked the wrong target. She was sitting in row 3,